And we're going to be reading from the Gospel of John, chapter 4. But we're not going to be reading all of it. It is a story that most of us will be familiar with. But we're going to be reading this morning specifically verses 1 to 7, and then 28 to 30, and then 39 to 42. Thank you, Roz.
John 4, verses 1 to 7, 28 to 30, and 39 to 42. Jesus knew the Pharisees had heard that he was baptizing and making more disciples than John, though Jesus himself didn't baptize them, his disciples did. So he left Judea and returned to Galilee. He had to go through Samaria on the way. Eventually he came to the Samaritan village of Sychar, near the field that Jacob gave to his son Joseph. Jacob's well was there, and Jesus, tired from the long walk, sat wearily beside the well about noontime. Soon a Samaritan woman came to draw water, and Jesus said to her, "Please give me a drink." The woman left her water jar beside the well and ran back to the village, telling everyone, "Come and see a man who told me everything I ever did. Could he possibly be the Messiah?" So the people came streaming from the village to see him. Many Samaritans from the village believed in Jesus because the woman had said, "He told me everything I ever did." When they came out to see him, they begged him to stay in their village. So he stayed for 2 days, long enough for many more to hear his message and believe. Then they said to the woman, "Now we believe, not just because of what you told us, but because we have heard him ourselves. Now we know that he is indeed the Saviour of the world."
Thank you very much. This is a story that most of us will be fairly familiar with. The story of the woman at the well, or Jesus and the Samaritan woman. But before we get back to this particular story, does anyone remember roughly what it was or what I was speaking about the last time that I came to bring a message on a Sunday morning? It was about a month ago. Anyone remember? Oh, well done. Loving God and loving people. A couple of people got it. Is this thing? There we go. Loving God and loving people. That's right. And I went on to, because you remember the cricket, of course. Yeah. And we went on to talk about something else that was important to do with that, which is to go and make disciples. And how loving people contains within it this call to go and make disciples. Because what people really, 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 really need in their lives is to find themselves in a wonderful relationship with Jesus Christ. Do they not? They need that in their lives. Now, even the most successful looking people in the world needs Jesus Christ, even if it seems like they don't need anything else. If they don't have Jesus in their lives, then they are in great, great need. And so part of loving those people is through helping them to come to know Jesus. And so we read from Matthew 28, where Jesus says to his disciples, "Go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and of the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything I have commanded you. And surely I am with you always to the very end of the age." So did you ever think that being a Christian could mean going and making disciples? Would most people have that in their mind when you think about being a Christian? This is a question that we were looking at this week with a group of ladies on Wednesday when we do a discipleship group. We were looking at the question, what does it mean to be a Christian? Now, for some people, maybe being a Christian means believing the stuff that Christians say they believe. Yeah, that's partly to do with it. Or maybe for some people, being a Christian is about coming to church once a week. Or maybe it's to do with behaving like a Christian, living a holy life, perhaps. And all those things are important. But if they don't include this part here, going and making disciples, then it's missing out something very, very important. Because Jesus gave to his church a mission, a purpose. And it's very, very important that we can understand and act upon that purpose. It's the mission that Jesus gave, to go and make disciples. But after I spoke last time around, I was having a conversation with Martha, and as often, we might do. And something that she said made me spark an idea in my head, which was, well, actually, do we really understand where we even begin? How on earth do we go about this thing called making disciples? And so if we've never had to ask ourselves that question before, then maybe it's something that we can be, oh, hang on a minute. What does that look like? What does that mean practically for me? What am I supposed to do? Make disciples. We need to work out what it means. Where do we begin? And so today, I wanted to offer my thoughts as to a starting point for making disciples. But first I'm going to tell you a story, if that's all right. It's a personal story. Oh, that's me when I was 24 years old. I'm the one on the right, obviously. I thought I'd get that in before Richard did. It did cross your mind, didn't it? And I found myself working in the town of Iquitos, which is in the Peruvian jungle along the Amazon River, hence the little friend there. And flick down. It's a bit of a fuzzy photo, but that's roughly Iquitos. It's quite a large town, and that's the Amazon River along there. That's a little bit clearer. So you can see that's the river. And these are sort of like some of the houseboats along the front there, like one of the sort of the basic port areas. And in 2005, I found myself in this place to be helping out at a pastor's conference and evangelistic campaign. And the whole event was going to be 2 weeks long. And I'd been taken up there by a friend of mine who's a Peruvian guy who I'd been working with in Argentina. And so this is where the main event was being held. And the first day I went along, and it was really, really hot, hotter than it ever is here, believe me. And it was humid, and it was sweaty, and there was a lot of people around. Loads of people crammed into this building. And everyone's singing and there's noise and it's all kind of like very sort of South American style church. And to be honest with you, it was quite overwhelming. I felt overwhelmed by this whole thing going on, and so I thought, well, I need some air, I think. And so I left the building that we were in just to get some air and to see what was going on maybe outside. And I happened to come across a bookstall. At Christian events, often if you've gone on to a Christian event, you'll know that they have a bookstall. And so there was this bookstall outside of the main event. And so I went up, and I was quite interested. There were some lovely books there. And there was this young woman who was serving at the bookstall. And she seemed very nice. And so I said to her, oh, hola, ¿cómo estás? Yo soy Mike. Which, for those of you who don't speak Spanish, means, hi, I'm Mike, how are you? Are you good? And we started up a conversation. And, I was sort of having a bit of looking at the books, and I talked, and she talked, and we stopped talking, and then I went off again. Probably had some work to do or something, and I guess she went back to selling books. But then the next day, I thought, well, those books did look pretty good. So I went back to the bookstore. And so I was having a bit of a look at the books, and the bookseller was there, and we had a bit of a chat. And so she talked, and I talked, and we talked, had a nice conversation, and then sort of went off our own separate ways again that day. Probably I had to go and do some translating or something. And so over the course of those couple of weeks, I felt it more and more necessary to find out as much about those books on the bookstore as was possible, even to the extent of, on occasion, accompanying the bookseller back to her accommodation and buying her ice cream, which is... Once the event was over, I even accompanied the bookseller back down to the river with the other people working on the event. They were heading off back to Colombia, and so they had to go and get a boat. Oh no, sorry, not that boat. That's the wrong boat. This boat here, that was the boat that they were going to be getting back along the Amazon River down to Colombia, and I flew back to Argentina. And the good news is the conversation did not stop there, you see. Back in 2005, we already had the amazing invention of internet. And so the conversation that I and the bookseller had started in the middle of the Amazon jungle in Iquitos was able to continue. And so I would find myself regularly in one of these kinds of places. It's called an internet cafe or cyber cafe. That dots Argentinian towns, or certainly did back in those times when not everyone could afford to have internet at home. It was quite an expensive deal. So most people would use a computer connected to the internet in a kind of like a public place, and you pay per hour, as it were. And so the conversation was able to continue. Those of you who have used Messenger back in 2005 will recognize this little symbol. And so, again, our conversation was able to continue until about 6 months later, I decided that I wanted to go and see the bookseller again, and we could, have some more talk, and talked about a few things, and we talked about getting married. And so there we are. I haven't changed a bit. No, I think I'm fatter. So that was back in 2005. And that's one story. I'll tell you another quick story, if you don't mind. Another time in Colombia, this was about 2009, and Martha and I, married by then, obviously, had gone off to the city of Cartagena, which is in the north coast of Colombia, and we were, again, going along to an event with Youth with a Mission, and we were staying with this young couple. They must have been in their 20s as well, I think. They were early 20s. Wonderful couple. They were pastors of a small church in Cartagena. And on the Sunday morning, we went along to their church service. And I can't remember hardly anything of what he preached on. I don't know if any of you can identify with that. That happens sometimes. That's why I try to make notes these days in sermons. But one thing I do remember, which actually is quite amazing, given that this was 10 years ago, I can still remember these particular words, the subject that he was talking about. And he was talking about this: conversations that change lives. That's all I can remember. I can't remember exactly kind of how he sort of developed that theme, but I can remember those words. Conversaciones que cambian las vidas. Conversations that change lives. And something within my heart said, yes, conversations change lives. And more I've thought about this particular phrase, the more it just seems to make an amazing amount of sense. If we think about how we came to know the person that we got married to, for those of us who are married, how did it all begin? Probably started with a conversation. How did those of us who went into a particular profession, how did we get into that profession in the first place? Possibly along the way, we'd had conversations with people working in that particular field. Or those of us who have had a particular job, Did you have to go along for a job interview? And is a job interview not a conversation about what that job will look like and about kind of who you are and whether those things were fit? And so again, I began to think about how the course of our lives are affected. And often we think that kind of what matters are our actions, because actions have consequences, and that is true. But what is it that determines our actions in life? Are they not decisions? But what is it that determines our decisions in life? Part of that is to do with our conversations, talking to other people about the issue at hand. And so you can find this flow that happens from conversations leading through to decisions that we make, that lead through to actions that change the course of our lives. And so this is the point that I want to get to this morning, and it's this. It's a one-point sermon today. That doesn't mean I'm about to stop. You thought you'd got it lucky, didn't you? But it is a one-point sermon, and it is this. The making disciples starts with conversation. Making disciples starts with conversation. If you have a look back into John 4, and it's interesting, there in John 4, in the first verse, it says that Jesus knew the Pharisees had heard that he was baptizing and making more disciples than John. So there it's talking about Jesus making disciples. Oh, hang on a minute. If we're going to learn about how to make disciples, then who should we learn from? How about the master disciple maker, Jesus Christ himself? He is the master disciple maker. And so if we are going to learn how to make disciples, then we should look at his example and the way that he went about it. And here in John 4, we have a prime example of how Jesus went about making disciples. And it starts with conversation. It starts with conversation. Can't remember what my next slide is. Is it relevant or not? Not. Well, yeah, of course that's relevant, yes, but we'll get there in a minute. Now, when I was a teenager, I left the church for probably the course of most of a year, possibly a bit more, because I was bored. I didn't find any point in going to church. It didn't seem to have any kind of purpose. This was when I was about 13 or 14 years old. I was fed up, and I said to my parents that I would prefer just to stay at home and watch Sunday morning TV than keep on going to church. And they were open enough at that time to give me that possibility. And they said, fine, we're not going to oblige you. We're not going to force you to go to church. If you don't want to, then you don't have to. So I didn't. The only reason that changed, and the only reason that I went back to church, and possibly the only reason that I could be here today, yes, God was looking out for me, yeah, he certainly was, but he sent a man to find me. Some of you would have known a guy who was working with our church up in Caterham for a while, a man called Paul Whyteleafe. Yeah. And he was the one who came back to me one day, and he started off a conversation. In that conversation, he said, Mike, would you like me to teach you how to play the drums? And I was like, much to my parents' concern, I'm sure, I said, yeah, that sounds great. And so I started a once-a-week drum lesson with Paul Whiting up in the church on Caterham Hill. And that was the start of things. You see, from that one conversation, that led to another conversation, and another conversation, and another conversation. And each time the conversations got deeper and deeper and deeper. And we talked about life, and we talked about God, and we talked about the Bible, and we talked about stuff. And then one day, maybe a couple of years later, I talked to him about, hey, Paul, I think I should get baptized. And I got baptized then when I was 16 years old. But it had all been a result of conversations and a series of conversations that had started with one single conversation. So through conversations, that man, directed by the Lord, had helped me become more a disciple of Jesus. Not a disciple of himself, but a disciple of Jesus, and to understand who Jesus was. And that in Jesus there is purpose. And again, for that reason, partly for that reason that I'm still here today, I'm sure. Now, if you click through the pages of Wikipedia, you can learn lots about the history of the world and different things that have happened and world events. You think about it, how much of the things that happen in the world happen because of conversations? People talking to one another. And sometimes we don't call them conversations. Sometimes we might call them summits. Sometimes they might be called meetings. You know, maybe between a president and a prime minister. And we call it a summit. We could call it a meeting. But at the end of the day, what they're having is a conversation. Two people talking about a range of issues that they then have to go away and make decisions about. And those decisions then having actions following on and consequences from those actions. And suddenly the course of world history is changed. If you flick through the Bible, let's go back to the Bible for a minute, we will find that the Bible is made up largely of two kinds of things, and I couldn't think of a better word than thing, so help me grammatically if you can. Two kinds of things you find in the Bible. Things that people did, sometimes things that God did, sometimes things that people did. But other times, things that people or God said. Does that make sense? Yeah, things that happened, actions, but then also things that people said, whether that was God or other people. Have a look through your Bible a bit later, and you'll see that what I'm saying is true. There's a lot of action, but there's also a lot of talk. And there's a correlation between those two things. And those bits of people talking, what they said, again, they weren't speeches. Most of the time. Some of them were. But even a speech, in a certain sense, is a kind of a conversation. Just so happens that those listening, on the most part, tend to be greater in number than the one doing most of the speaking. But they're conversations, really. And if you think about it, God's conversation with Adam in the Garden of Eden, and then Eve's conversation with the serpent in the Garden of Eden. God's conversation with Noah, and then a subsequent conversation that isn't registered in the Bible, but I'm sure happened between Noah and the rest of his family. Or Noah and his wife. I'm sure they had a conversation. Or did Noah just, start building a boat, like in the back of his garage, and hope his wife didn't notice? Like some people do when they're going to buy a little clapped-out old sports car. No, I'm sure Noah, eventually he had to say something to Mrs. Noah. They had to have a conversation, and with the rest of his kids. God's conversation with Moses. And we all know about the burning bush and subsequent conversations. How did that change the course of the history of the people of Israel? And Moses' conversations with Pharaoh, and it goes on. It goes on. Even if you go back again to Genesis 1, the creation of mankind, how did mankind come about? God said, let us make mankind in our image. Yeah, we could get into the doctrine of theology, but I'm not going to this morning because we don't have time. But it was a conversation. There was a conversation that happened that resulted in mankind being created. Let us make man in our own image. Interesting. And so again, throughout the Bible, different conversations, like the one we find in John 4. Again, I can't remember which slide up. Oh, okay, this is good. John 4. And so an artist's impression of the place the story of John 4 happens. And another picture. Jesus sat down by the well in Samaria at midday. Funnily enough, midday being the time when most other people, sensible people, were having a siesta. Which again I can very much relate to through being in South America. In the middle part of the day, in places that it's hot and humid, you are crazy if you're outside between, say, 11 o'clock in the morning and 4 in the afternoon. Most sensible people will go off and they will have a siesta under a fan or air conditioning if you're lucky enough. Because it's just too hot to be doing stuff. Too hot to be drawing water up out of a well. Why on earth did this woman come along at midday to draw water out of the well? Seems to me like she was avoiding other people. She didn't want to have to talk to other people in her village that she knew would be around at other times of day, because she knew what kind of life she'd been living and she knew what other people thought of her because of that. And yet, Jesus, he knew where she would be. And so there's this conversation. Jesus starts it. Jesus starts the conversation with these words, "Please give me a drink." Fairly innocuous. Easy going. "Please give me a drink," he says. And then the conversation develops from then. He talks about living water. That gets her a bit interested. What does that mean? And then again in the conversation, where Jesus just doesn't accuse her, but he says something like, "Well, yeah, you've had 4 husbands, and the guy that you're with at the moment isn't your husband." How on earth did Jesus know that? She was thinking, surely. How on earth does he know this? And she went back with her heart so full and so excited that she was actually capable of going and seeking out and talking to the very people that most likely she had been avoiding. I forgot this other picture. I thought that was quite interesting. I think that the photographer or the artist is kind of drawing on the fact that, she's someone who's had 4 husbands and the guy that she's with now isn't her husband. But she goes back with her heart so full that even she goes and looks out the people, the very people that she had been avoiding, to go and tell them what it was that she had found or who it was that she had found. And they believed too. They came along and they believed her. There must have been something about her. Something about her expression. Something about the way that she carried herself on that occasion, going and telling people that they knew, wow, something's happened. This isn't just chit-chat. She hadn't made this up. Something real here. And so they went out and they found out who Jesus was. And they spoke to Jesus, more little conversations. And so they too believed. And they said, "Now we believe, not just because of what you told us, but because we have heard him ourselves. Now we know that he is indeed the Savior of the world." People came to faith in Jesus, but it all started with what? A conversation. A simple conversation that went step by step. And so again, we look further into the Bible and we find other people having other kinds of conversations. The disciples, well, they went off and they did stuff. When they became the apostles, once Jesus had risen up into heaven, they became apostles sent out. And they went and did stuff. That's why we call it the Acts of the Apostles. But also they said a lot of stuff too. They had a lot of conversations with people. And the Apostle Paul, so much of what happens throughout his life and ministry, yes, there's stuff that happens, but also things that he says and he speaks to people. In Acts 16, it says this. They're in the city of Philippi by this time. On the Sabbath, we went outside the city gate to the river where we expected to find a place of prayer. We sat down and we began to speak to the women who had gathered there. One of those listening was a woman from the city of Thyatira named Lydia, a dealer in purple cloth. She was a worshipper of God. The Lord opened her heart to respond to Paul's message, and she and members of her household were baptized. Again, Paul and his teammates in conversation with this group of people that they'd just met sitting by the river or working by the river. And God used those conversations. And people believed and they got baptized. You remember last October, we had some baptisms up here. Do you remember how we had baptisms up here last October? Do you know how that came to be? As the work of God in people's hearts? Yes, but through conversations, talking to those people who finally got baptized, telling them about Jesus, speaking about who he is and God's love and the way that salvation is possible, even for those of us who have made so many mistakes in life. And so those people got baptized because they believed the message. Just as it says here in Acts 16, they believed the message. And because God had opened up their hearts to receive the message. And so that is disciple making. That is lives being transformed little by little, conversation by conversation, week by week. And this verse to me seemed very, very important. And it's from Proverbs chapter 18, verse 21. Proverbs 18:21. The tongue has the power of life and death. It's got the power of life and death. And I was looking at that passage in James 3. It talks about taming the tongue. And so like James is kind of more warnings about the dangers of the tongue and the dangers of the stupid things that we say sometimes. But it's interesting that, yes, the tongue does have the power of death. We can tear people down with the things that we say. But we also hold the power of life through the things that we say. And I think that is a very, very exciting prospect. Don't you think? Only one person thought that. Don't you think? It's an exciting prospect that our tongue, our words, can hold within them the power of life. Not because we're particularly clever answers that people are looking for, but because we talk about Jesus Christ, who's the one who is all the answer that they need. And we talk about the life that God gives us and the power that God has for those of us who believe. And that is an amazing prospect. It's an amazing opportunity. And so in thinking about disciple making, and we've looked at John 4 today to see about how he went about it. And we see that he began in conversation with individuals. Often as a church, we can fall into the trap, and I read this recently. But one of the books I read, the author was saying that, don't fall into the trap of thinking that we need to reach the community in the sense that we forget that actually the community is made up of individuals. It's made up of individuals, and we need to think more about reaching individuals than we do reaching the community. Does that make sense? Yeah, we do need to reach the community, but it's kind of like, well, it's one person at a time. It's one person at a time. Otherwise, the task becomes too big. As someone once said, how do you eat an elephant? How do you eat an elephant? One piece at a time. I'm not suggesting that you do that. Obviously, that goes against all kinds of international ecological laws. Let's get that straight. But anyway, so conversations are the way to go. Being intentional, we find that Jesus was intentional about his conversations and the people that he ends up talking to. Often he will seek people out, or he will stay around. Like in this case, he was waiting for someone that I believe he knew who he was waiting for. Being intentional. Slowing down. We live such busy lives, and so often we're zipping about from here to there and there and the next thing, and so all our conversations are, hi, how are you doing? Yeah, you good? Yeah, I'm fine. Okay, see ya later, bye, and that's it. Well, that's why they call it the lost art of conversation, because most of the time we don't have decent conversations anymore, because we're living a life so zip, 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 zip. And so slowing down, I think, in the way that we live our lives and the rhythm of our lives is kind of important, so that we give time to God for opportunities for conversations with people. Cast a line. That's one thing that we see that Jesus did, was he casts a line. He sort of slips in just a little thing about living water. And if you knew who I was, then you would ask me for living water. He kind of like, it's just a little... No, we're talking about being fishers of men. You cast a line and see if someone bites. Which she did. She was interested. Come on. So look for a positive response. That's where they bite. Look for a positive response in people. If you mention something about the way that you live your life being somehow different, is there a positive response? But again, don't force it. I'm not talking about forcing conversation so that you kind of become someone that people avoid because they think you're weird. So I read Jeff Lucas talk about that recently. Don't force it. Don't be weird, but just look out for people who are showing signs of being interested in the spiritual things of life. It's extraordinary. I was talking to someone very, very recently how so many people, the majority of people in this country, in this world probably, are interested in the spiritual side of life. Very, very few people have kind of done away with this idea that a spiritual life, they say, it doesn't exist. Most people believe that there is a spiritual life, that there is more to life than just what we see and hear around us. They just haven't worked out what it is yet. And so that's kind of where we come in, is to help people gradually find out what it is that is the truth about life. And building friendships, so important. It's a step-by-step process. Kind of a bit like me and Martha. It was a step-by-step process. It was one conversation, and then a few days later, another conversation, then a week later, another conversation. Step by step by step. But there was a friendship growing. So that we can move from having contact to connections. There's a lot of people in our world that maybe we have a contact with. It's someone we perhaps see, I don't know, for those of us who pick up kids, we see them at the school gate once a day, we say hi. It's a contact. But there's no real connection. But you build a connection with people by actually having conversations and finding out where they're at and what they're up to and how things are. Maybe an opportunity to say, well, do you want me to pray? Do you want me to pray with you about that? That's what happened with these blooming baptisms that we had last year. A lot of that was just through saying, would you like us to pray for you about that situation? And they said, okay. And we prayed and God acted and they saw that God was real. Bang. And so, think about this for the rest of today and the rest of this week. If you can't remember anything else about what I've said, remember this. Conversations change lives. Conversations change lives. And hopefully at some point in the not too distant future, we'll be able to talk a little bit more about things like, how we talk about what God's done in our life and how to explain in a fairly brief but clear way what the gospel message is. We're going to be looking at that, hopefully. But for the minute, your takeaway, conversations change lives. Think about the way that you have conversations out in the real world and how you've got the opportunity to build up and to bring people life and encouragement. It's a wonderful thing. Don't keep quiet. Speak out. Amen?